June 4, 1943. In the cramped darkness of a Texas railcar, a German prisoner of war scrawled a sentence that would have been punished back home. The Americans must be lying. He underlined it once, then crossed it out and wrote again, as if the act of recording could reconcile what his eyes refused to accept. Outside, in the small, electrified towns sliding past the window, streetlights burned as steadily as if no war existed. Inside, the carriage smelled of coal, coffee, and the faint iron tang of nervous sweat. The line on the page is the clearest proof we have of a single shattering moment. An entire system of belief meeting the physical, humming reality of American industry and failing. This story begins there, with cognitive dissonance made visible. Men schooled to hate and fear a decadent enemy find themselves fed, bathed, and transported in comforts they had been taught to associate with moral decay. It is the tale of how the machinery of American production, ships, trains, factories, power grids, and the thousands of small conveniences of daily life became evidence, for some, that the world they had been told existed did not. It is not a tale of conversion in absolutes, nor of triumphal spectacle. It is, instead, an account of astonishment, of slow reappraisal, and of human witnessing. The men in those railcars had come from battlefields and prison camps across North Africa. They had been processed in organized, efficient stations, places like Oran, where military order met bureaucratic competency. Records and survivors' notes describe antiseptic tents, clear forms, and quick medical checks. Men counted, cataloged, vaccinated. The paperwork that accompanied each group emphasized two things Americans believed essential to humane custody: identity and dignity. For many German captives, this routine was the first indication that the war outside Europe could be run like a clockwork machine that did not seek to dehumanize. Boarding the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic introduced a new register of astonishment. The vessels themselves were symbols, workhorses launched by American yards in numbers and speed that stunned observers. For the prisoners, the sea crossing was a study in abundance and in the visible rhythms of supply. On board, food was plentiful in ways that felt obscene to men whom wartime rationing and propaganda had taught to imagine every American kitchen as a sink of waste. Kurt Zimmerman, who kept a diary during the voyage, wrote of corridors lined with crates of fresh fruit and stewards distributing milk by the quart. He described steaks being prepared in galley after galley, then tossed into compost because there simply were more than could be consumed. The detail recurs in several accounts: steaks, pies, cases of canned goods, quantities that could not be reconciled with the doctrine of scarcity they knew. That apparent extravagance was not mockery. The Americans who fed the ships were guided by logistics and supply chains that assumed plenty as a strategic asset. Feed your troops, feed the fleet, and never allow need to become a weakness. For prisoners watching, the sight of larders fully stocked and milk passages alone constituted a kind of evidence. "They poured out milk like water," one man wrote. "We had been told they starved. Instead, they wasted." The vocabulary, waste, plenty, pouring, returns because it was the only way to describe the dissonance. The material abundance of the convoy was not merely nourishment, it was a performative demonstration of capacity. Those Liberty-type vessels carried more than men. They carried a message by default. Shipyards across the United States were turning out hulls at a tempo that the prisoners could feel even from their bunks. Cranes swung with an almost musical metronome. Welders flashed like distant stars, and the sheer scale of yards at harbor approached the sublime. Contemporary records described concentrated, routinized labor. Prefabricated sections arriving from workshops, modular fits, and assembly lines that treated steel as if it were putty to be shaped and joined. For men raised on tales of national decrepitude, the sight was not an argument based on rhetoric. It was an argument of sight and smell and sound. When the transports finally approached the American coastline, the scale of logistics revealed itself anew. Norfolk's piers presented a panorama of cranes, warehouses, and endless rails. Men who had expected to be shunted into hubs or penned on exposed beaches found themselves unloaded into a landscape of order. Pullman cars, real Pullmans, not freight wagons, lined up to carry prisoners inland. These cars had upholstered seats, functioning toilets, and air cooling systems that made the word Pullman in German ears read like a foreign luxury. A POW note from the arrival day reads less as a complaint than as disorientation. They gave us chairs to sit in. It felt wrong. Train journeys across the United States provided the next round of evidentiary encounters. For days at a time, prisoners pressed their faces to windows and watched the country move by in a tempo that was industrial, not feudal. Small towns shone with electric light, factories operated in shifts that blurred day and night, and lines of parked cars at plant gates suggested a full-bodied civilian workforce tied intimately to production. Where propaganda had pictured America as a place riven by unemployment and idle grandeur, the rail's slow reveal showed three-shift rhythms, humming factories, and a civic order that assumed electricity as a baseline. As trains crossed plains and rivers, prisoners witnessed specific nodes of production whose scale became chits of proof against their former doctrine. In Michigan, the River Rouge complex, its furnaces and rolling lines, seemed to embody steel's capacity to be redrawn into tools of mass production.
In Ohio and Pennsylvania, aluminum mills and synthetic rubber plants produced materials that fed both military and civilian markets. In Detroit's environs, the rhythm of auto assembly was an infrastructural lesson in miniaturized industrial organization. At Willow Run, where B-24 bombers were assembled on a famously long production line, wartime records note that planes rolled off the line at rates that shocked even experienced inspectors. One contemporaneous record puts the rhythm of assembly at a bomber being completed every 63 minutes. For a captive audience, these numbers were not abstractions. They were the reason breakfast was served on time, why trains moved, why the docks kept turning. Such scenes, seen through a fogged train window, accomplished a subtle pedagogical work. Men trained to read the world through ideological narratives began to learn by seeing. Observation became its own teacher. A farmer wrote home years later that the first time he saw a tractor pulling a combine through a Kansas field, he understood mechanization in a new way. What had taken weeks now took hours. A factory worker noted the seeming endlessness of canned food lines. Where home kitchens had taught economy, canneries taught scale and redundancy. The very ordinariness of these sites, the hum of conveyors, the even click of a packed assembly, became a cumulative argument. On board those trains, conversations changed. Initially, prisoners compared notes in small cliques, reciting the names of places that seemed to exist only as labels. Rubbertown, one man murmured, as if the syllable itself opened a window. They exchanged details about air conditioning in dining cars or about the regularity of station announcements. A non-commissioned officer, recorded in a later memoir as Wilhelm von Stobern, as transcribed, verification needed, tried to catalog each new impression with military precision. Lights counted per mile, the frequency of station stops, the number of factories visible from any stretch. Yet the catalog itself became less a log than a kind of disbelief gradually replaced by constrained curiosity. Not all reactions were wonder. Some prisoners reacted with suspicion or anger, insisting the scenes were staged or that local civilians were performing for cameras. The initial impulse for many was to assume manipulation. They must be lying, repeated in the phrases of many diaries. That suspicion was part of the cognitive architecture built by years of indoctrination. The enemy is always portraying itself as greater than it is. But the scenes persisted. Factories ran day after day. Milk dairies shipped crates by the trainload. Towns passed and repassed. There was no compelling evidence that everything was choreography. Slowly, the presumption of deceit met the persistence of production.
The sea and rails had provided two experiential proofs, but the arrival at camps would transform shock into lived routine. When prisoners stepped down at American encampments, they encountered an infrastructure of care that diverged from the punitive images conjured by enemy propaganda. Camp Hearn in Texas, like others scattered across the Midwest and South, had facilities for hygiene and health, hot showers, flush toilets, and hospitals equipped with medicines then considered modern. Accounts emphasize penicillin, a relatively new antibiotic in 1943, available in quantities that for many prisoners spell the difference between lingering infection and rapid recovery. Soldiers who came ashore with wounds reported prompt dressings, clinics with trained staff, and the use of drugs that had been rare in wartime Europe. Kitchens at these camps operated on an industrial logic of feeding. Mess halls served meals in shifts, with more food offered than a man dared request at first. Some POWs, still seeing deprivation as a marker of virtue, refused seconds because to take more felt dishonorable. Others, watching Americans carry trays of food with a casualness they could not fathom, took the extras out of survival. The image of stewards carrying trays piled with bread and butter returns in numerous journals. One diarist named Hans Moore noted the sight of loaves the size of bales, whole platters of fruit, and garrisons of vegetables he had never before tasted cooked so simply. Outside the barbed wire, civilian generosity unfolded in small gestures that carried weight. Religious groups organized choirs that sang in German during holiday observances. Church committees collected and distributed what were later estimated to be 500,000 Christmas packages to prisoners, bundles that contained items as small as candy and as consequential as socks. Local Boy Scout troops and civic clubs sent letters and care packets. In some camps, the Red Cross facilitated communication between prisoners and families. Such gestures created an emotional dissonance distinct from the industrial one. Men who had been taught to expect contempt instead encountered courtesy. This was not a uniform experience across all camps or all civilians, but the cumulative effect where it occurred was profound. The physical arrangements inside the compounds further undermined stereotypes. Tents were replaced by barracks in many locations. Recreation facilities, volleyball courts, lecture halls, libraries were set up not as mockeries, but as attempts to maintain order and morale. Camp newspapers written by prisoners circulated, providing a forum for commentary and debate. Educators arranged correspondence courses with universities. In some instances, prisoners could enroll in classes by mail and receive reading lists and assignments that would broaden intellectual horizons beyond the confines of previous schooling. Outside the barbed wire, civilian generosity unfolded in small gestures that carried weight. Religious groups organized choirs that sang in German during holiday observances. Church committees collected and distributed what were later estimated to be 500,000 Christmas packages to prisoners, bundles that contained items as small as candy and as consequential as socks. Local Boy Scout troops and civic clubs sent letters and care packets. In some camps, the Red Cross facilitated communication between prisoners and families. Such gestures created an emotional dissonance distinct from the industrial one. Men who had been taught to expect contempt instead encountered courtesy. This was not a uniform experience across all camps or all civilians, but the cumulative effect where it occurred was profound. The physical arrangements inside the compounds further undermined stereotypes. Tents were replaced by barracks in many locations. Recreation facilities, volleyball courts, lecture halls, libraries were set up not as mockeries, but as attempts to maintain order and morale. Camp newspapers written by prisoners circulated, providing a forum for commentary and debate. Educators arranged correspondence courses with universities. In some instances, prisoners could enroll in classes by mail and receive reading lists and assignments that would broaden intellectual horizons beyond the confines of previous schooling.
These structured opportunities fed into a longer, quieter process of reevaluation. Work programs bound the macro and micro together. Under supervision and within Geneva Convention limits, prisoners were assigned to agricultural tasks and non-combatant industrial labor that exposed them directly to American methods. In fields across the Midwest, they encountered mechanized harvesters and tractors that transformed labor intensity. Combines that cut swaths through wheat and corn in a matter of hours replaced practices that would have taken weeks by hand. In canneries and cold storage plants, prisoners witnessed chilling units and conveyors designed to preserve perishable goods on a scale their wartime economies had rarely needed. These were not frontline factories turning shells into shrapnel, but integral elements of a production ecology that made mobilization sustainable: food processing, transport, maintenance. The labor itself, while supervised and regulated, was instructive. Men who had been mechanics or craftsmen found their skills applied in systems of mass production. Education and re-education were not coercive ideological campaigns. They were instead channels for information and debate. Camp studies offered languages, civics, and practical subjects. Lectures were given by Americans and sometimes by prisoners themselves, and camp newspapers carried editorials that engaged critical thought. Enrollment statistics in these programs, cited in multiple camp reports, show robust participation. Thousands signed up for correspondence courses, and camp libraries circulated tens of thousands of volumes. That data, as prosaic as it seems, mattered. When a man reads a civics primer and discusses it with his peers, his intellectual horizon widens in a way that is different from the blunt instrument of propaganda. And yet the transformation was partial and uneven. It unfolded in fits and starts, subject to the individual histories and predispositions of the prisoners. Some remained resolute in their beliefs, others became skeptics, and a number moved toward a more democratic skepticism about authority. Officers and enlisted men often reacted differently. Rank shaped access to information, and social networks inside camps shaped interpretive frames. Documents of the period caution historians not to overstate the extent of ideological conversion. Primary source percentages indicate that while significant minorities changed their outlooks, many did not. The more important point is less statistical than qualitative. For a sizable portion of those who experienced American industrialism and hospitality firsthand, the encounter produced a lasting cognitive rupture. It is crucial to state what these encounters were not. They were not a universal softening of hearts, nor did they erase the realities of war crimes or the moral responsibilities Germany bore. They had not yet stood next to a refrigerated dock stacked with crates bound for distant fronts, nor had they been led through a hospital ward where penicillin turned septic wounds into recoveries. But the train's slow halt at the station, metal on metal, a squeal, a brief exhale of steam, produced a collective intake of breath. Outside, a foreman waved a baton. Inside, men straightened their shoulders. They were about to be shown, not told. If you find yourself drawn into this unfolding, stay with the details, the small sensory moments that add up to something larger. Subscribe to follow the full narrative. There are primary source accounts and archival photographs that map this journey from disbelief to the first tentative steps of reassessment. The rest of the story picks up where the wheels stop and the gates open. In factories where steel becomes wings. In camps where kindness complicates culpability. And at the juncture where a nation's productive life becomes a silent, persuasive argument. They stepped from the train into the smell of iron and oil, and the scale closed in like a lesson. A foreman with a white hat waved them toward a gate. Beyond it, a factory roof unrolled for acres, a shallow ocean of skylights and smoke. Inside, the noise was not the thunder of artillery, but a different, continuous percussion. Presses stamping in unison, conveyor belts sliding like a heartbeat, pneumatic hammers punctuating the air at steady intervals. Men who had known the cadence of drilling in command now realized there was another rhythm, an industrial time that measured productivity in hours and units, not marches and maneuvers. At Willow Run, the long shed where B-24 Liberators were assembled, prisoners walked the aisles between stands of fuselages and wings. The line itself was a language. Workers moved like a chorus, each performing a small, precise action. A rivet set here, a control cable looped there, an engine hoisted into place. Archive records note a famous tempo. One bomber finished every 63 minutes, an almost unbelievable figure that, for men accustomed to artisanal planes and slower yards, read like prophecy. A German mechanic recorded in clipped eins that the factory's magnitude made his training look like the labor of a single carpenter. Here, 10,000 hands cooperated so that what one man could have done in months became a single day's product. In the River Rouge complex, the scene was different, but no less persuasive. Steel arrived as molten intent and left as chassis, beams, and hulls, the very skeletons of modern life. Furnaces glowed like soft suns. Overhead cranes, moving with orchestral deliberation, carried loads that would have required whole brigades to move by hand in earlier eras. A POW noted the smell of coke and the metallic sweetness of new steel, a sensory detail repeated in several diaries.
The perception mattered. It was not only that machines worked, but that people worked with systems, supply, heat treatment, rolling, stamping, wired into an infrastructure that made once rare objects ordinary. Rubbertown and the synthetic rubber plants offered a different kind of revelation. Men who had served on fronts where rubber shortages were a fact of life now saw vats and reactors churning out a commodity that in Europe had been rationed and reallocated. The chemical smells, solvents, sulfur, hit the air alongside conveyor belts of tires and gaskets. For prisoners who remembered cobbled repairs and patched tires, the sight of abundant rubber translated into a new understanding of logistics. War depended on the reproduction of raw materials as much as on battlefield valor. In these plants, the presence of specialized machinery, injection molders, stamping presses, refrigeration units, meant that the United States did not simply possess craftsmen, it possessed standardized systems for turning matter into durable, transportable goods at scale. That observation, repeated from ship decks to camp gates, functioned as a slow-acting pedagogy. The prisoners were not simply seeing objects, they were seeing relationships. Inputs to outputs, raw to finished, wages to production. To an audience trained to read everything through the lens of ideological scarcity, these relationships were evidence that the American economy ran on a logic fundamentally different from the one they had been taught to expect. One afternoon in a cannery, the auditory present was a chorus of lids screwing, labels passing, and steam escaping in regular, polite intervals. Crates of peaches rolled past on belts. Mashed tomatoes flowed into bladders destined for shipment. Men in sanitized coats inspected jars and sealed them with clinical motions. A POW who had worked in a small German preserves plant before the war later wrote that the scale was the thing. Machines that peeled, blanched, canned, and boxed more fruit in an hour than his old plant could in a month. For him, the realization had a moral valence. If an economy could spare such volume for civilians and troops both, then the premise that the enemy populace was doling out penury as public virtue began to crumble. The sensory thread through all these vignettes, sight, sound, smell, made an argument that words alone could not. The testimony is not uniform. Diaries sometimes contradict each other. But the recurrent motifs are clear. Continuous light, the regularity of shifts, the abundance of consumables, and an infrastructure that made transportation, storage, and distribution routine. Prisoners learned that production was less a political boast and more a technical architecture. Back in the camps, these lessons translated into the quotidian. Camp hospitals, remarked upon again and again, operated with medicines and procedures many had not seen at home. Penicillin, then an emergent miracle of modern medicine, appears repeatedly in accounts as something close to providence. Wounds that might have festered in other theaters closed cleanly. Infections that once defined high mortality rates were subdued. A surgeon mentioned in a camp report, Dr. Friedrich Bauer, as transcribed, verification needed, assisted in several such recoveries.
His name appears in a few memoir notes and must be verified against archival lists, but his presence in the accounts typifies the new medical capacity prisoners encountered. Kitchens moved with military-like precision, yet exuded a civilian domestic comfort. Mess halls served plate after plate, and the phrase "too much food" surfaces often enough to be meaningful. Some prisoners were unnerved by this. One officer, in a journal, refused to eat dessert for a week out of principle. Another, starving before capture, accepted every offering with a mix of gratitude and guilt. These reactions reveal not only hunger, but the interior ethical codes men carried. Scarcity had been moralized. Where communities at home praised thrift, here abundance was a social fact that demanded interpretation. The civilian outreach that accompanied institutional care deepened the encounter's emotional stakes. Churches and civic groups folded their hands into wartime charity. Choirs sang hymns in German at Christmas services. Community committees organized parcels that, in aggregate, numbered a staggering 500,000 gifts distributed to detainees. Butts, blankets, tobacco, chocolate, letters. That number, offered in contemporary accounts and reproduced in camp summaries, must be treated with archival caution. But its recurrence across diaries and local press reports suggests a magnitude of civilian engagement that affected prisoners' everyday experience. Some gestures were small, almost private. A woman in a rural town might hand a basket of freshly baked rolls to a truck unloading uniforms. A Boy Scout chapter sent a stack of picture postcards. A factory floor took time to teach a prisoner how a particular machine worked rather than scorn his curiosity. These moments created relational threads that complicated the prisoner's mental map. Suddenly, the enemy was not a faceless mass, but individuals. A mechanic who lent a wrench, a priest who visited to translate a parcel's contents, a teacher who held a correspondence class. Work programs bridged seeing to doing. Prisoners in agricultural detachments learned to operate combines and tractors whose mechanization made the hand sickle a historical footnote. One camp report recounts a small group of POWs assigned to a Kansas farm where within a day they watched a single combine harvest what once would have required a crew for days. The feeling repeated elsewhere: astonishment at speed, admiring the engineering, and simultaneously experiencing the emotional dissonance of performing productive labor under military supervision. In industry, prisoners found roles that matched pre-war trades. Machinists at arc welders, tailors at factory presses, bakers in large-scale bakeries. Their labor was regulated by the Geneva Convention, non-combatant, compensated in small sums, but the educational effect was unanticipated. A mechanic who had worked on a bench might, when placed among a line of specialized tools and machine jigs, begin to see possibilities for retooling and mass production. Letters home occasionally turned technocratic. Diagrams of machines, notes on suppliers, the names of parents' towns appended with new vocabulary: sprocket, die, reducer. Camp intellectual life amplified this practical learning. University correspondence courses, some administered through established institutions, allowed prisoners to pursue subjects ranging from English to basic engineering. Camp libraries, stocked with donated volumes, became places of quiet transformation. A man who had been a school teacher before the war read about American civics and later wrote essays discussing federal versus local authority. Another wrote that reading about worker unions forced him to reconsider the relationship between labor and capital. These shifts were incremental: a pamphlet on municipal government, a lecture on agricultural economics, a debate in a camp newspaper over the ethics of coercion. Taken together, they shaped attitudes more effectively than any single conversionary moment. It is crucial to underscore the unevenness of these processes. Not every POW enrolled in a course or accepted kindness. Officers had greater access to libraries and correspondence. Non-commissioned men sometimes found the direct physical labor more sacralizing to their identities. Political commitment to National Socialism varied widely. Where some men used their time to sharpen ideological defenses, others grew skeptical or openly critical. A modest but significant number recanted earlier positions in letters and post-war interviews. Others retained loyalty to their old convictions. Contemporary camp reports and later historians caution against blanket claims. Re-education was as much a process of exposure and choice as it was of instruction. The decisive rupture for many came not in workshops or canteens, but in images, a sequence of newsreels and, later, footage of liberation. On the day when filming of D-Day and subsequent supply operations reached the camps, men watched logistics unfold on screens. Convoys moving like veins, ports loaded with materiel, paratroopers and landing craft coordinated like parts of a machine. For prisoners already sensitized by factories and trains, the newsreels functioned as a synthetic review. They confirmed that the industrial scenes they had seen were not isolated miracles, but part of an overarching capacity. The war effort, the reels argued, was not only courage, but logistics made visible.
Not long after, armies showed footage of liberated concentration camps to some detainee audiences. The effect was catastrophic in moral terms. For a nation that had been taught to regard Jews and other victims as enemies' problems, the footage produced shock, shame, and anger in various proportions among POWs. Some men claimed ignorance. Others, confronted with the visible consequences of policies they had once rationalized or denied, reacted with profound remorse. The juxtaposition, witnessing both the marvels of American production and the horrific outcomes of Nazi policy, formed an ethical crucible that left many prisoners unsettled in ways industry alone had not achieved. Here the historian must be careful. The revelation of atrocity did not uniformly translate into acceptance of responsibility. Some justified, some minimized, some wept. What the sources strongly suggest, however, is that the combination of material demonstration and moral confrontation altered the terms of post-war reconstruction because it introduced a new cohort of German men to alternative modes of organizing society, technical, civic, humanitarian, at a decisive moment. Repatriation followed military and political timelines. It was not a single event, but a rolling process shaped by labor needs and logistical constraints. Men returned to a Germany in rubble, but not without resources of thought and skill acquired in the camps. A number of former POWs, engineers, mechanics, agricultural foremen, later appear in Reconstruction narratives as technicians who applied what they had seen in American plants and farms to the task of rebuilding. Some immigrated, bringing practical knowledge and personal ties that facilitated post-war migration and economic exchange. Others remained in Germany, but kept in correspondence with Americans they had met, clergy, local citizens, or even foremen who had shown them parts of a production line. The post-war imprint of these experiences is complex. On one hand, American material demonstration had a propagandistic function. Abundance and order made the United States political and economic model appear not only viable but preferable. On the other hand, the human dimension, the dignity shown in medical care, the small acts of kindness, the chance to study and debate, conveyed civic norms that were not reducible to machines and output. Together, these elements contributed to an environment in which democratic institutions and capitalist economies could find footholds in a devastated Europe. This does not equate to a teleological narrative in which American industry single-handedly rebuilt Europe. The Marshall Plan, local initiative, and the sheer resilience of German society shaped the Wirtschaftswunder as much as any external demonstration. Yet the lived experience of prisoners, seeing mechanized harvesters, walking assembly lines, reading civics primers, tasting steady bread, provided a human vector for the transmission of practical and ideological information. Some former prisoners would later take roles in factories that resembled the ones they had seen in the United States. Others would immigrate to places where those experiences facilitated employment. The link between observation and later action is uneven but documentable in a number of individual trajectories. Statistical evidence supports the claim that these encounters were not mere anecdotes.
Camp records and military reports show broad participation in work and education programs. Enrollment numbers for correspondence courses run into the thousands across camps. Camp libraries circulated large quantities of books. Labor detachments contributed significant man days to agricultural harvests and non-combatant industry. Escape rates, recorded in prisoner of war tallies, remained relatively low in many U.S. camps, a fact historians attribute partly to the adequacy of provisions and partly to the regulated freedoms afforded within camp structures. These quantitative elements matter because they indicate that the experiences were not confined to elites or isolated cases. They formed a networked set of encounters that touched a substantial portion of the POW population. Even with the numbers, however, the most persuasive evidence remains the diaries and letters, the human testimony that renders abstract facts into interior life. A cook at a Midwestern camp, recorded in a private letter, described going home after release and being unable to eat the same way. His stomach had adjusted to the foreign abundance, and he found himself scolding his own children for waste. Another man, a former corporal, later wrote that his experience in American classes on municipal planning had convinced him to vote for local-level governance reforms in his town after the war. These are not proof of universal conversion, they are windows into the variegated aftermath of exposure. Some accounts raise cautionary notes. A handful of men later recounted incidents of mistreatment in certain camps or the persistence of prejudice in local communities. Others testify to the strict limits of interaction, noting that most civilians never crossed the barbed wire. The archival record preserves both warmth and distance. Military administrators sometimes prioritize security and efficiency over cultural exchange. Local politics and racial segregation in parts of the United States complicated the picture. Black American citizens, for example, encountered their own forms of exclusion at the time, a historical fact that complicates any unalloyed picture of benevolence. The script must resist tidy resolutions. The human story here is a collage of generosity, institutional discipline, and real-world constraints. By late 1945, repatriation operations accelerated. Men left with trunks or with the clothes on their backs, some bearing the smell of American machines and kitchens still in their memory. Post-war records show that a measurable minority returned to lives that bore American traces. New techniques in pottery, metalwork, or farming. Letters that maintained friendships. Migration stories that linked small towns in the United States to villages in Germany. A reunion photograph taken in the 1950s, a common artifact in archiving, shows former prisoners standing beside American veterans, their faces a mix of kinship and distance. Another reunion, decades later, records men who returned to visit camps now closed, exchanging handshakes with former guards. These images underline a central paradox. The wartime encounter created both a gulf and a bridge. Historians who have studied these phenomena are cautious in their claims. They note that the conversion of prisoners toward democratic sympathy was partial, context-dependent, and often ephemeral. Yet they also emphasize that seeing matters. The argument the POWs confronted was empirical. It was not the rhetoric of speeches, but the operation of economies and the medical success of antibiotics. It was the sight of packed trains, not a pamphlet. For many prisoners, that kind of evidence proved persuasive. The final chapters of this narrative concern legacy more than victory. Arsenal of democracy is a phrase that names material production. In the lived experience of POWs, it meant something broader. Production became evidence. Abundance became moral demonstration. Professional competence became an argument for the possibility of different social arrangements. The United States' advantage was not simply in hardware, but in demonstrating that equipment and organization could sustain both warfighting capacity and civilian life. To those watching from behind barbed wire, that demonstration sometimes read as an ethical exhortation. One could build, feed, heal, and educate on a scale that made certain authoritarian narratives implausible. We returned briefly and reverently to a handful of individual testimonies that crystallized this complex outcome. Wilhelm von Stobern, an officer who kept meticulous notes during his transfer and subsequent internment, later recorded that the experience of seeing an assembly line finish a bomber in an hour had altered his sense of what modern states could do. Hans Muir wrote of the peculiar pain of gratitude, feeling ashamed for benefit while recognizing the human care behind it. Kurt Zimmerman described the milk poured out on the Liberty ship as a moment when propaganda failed. The physical abundance simply would not be explained away. These names, as they appear in the source material, contain transcription errors in some instances. Their precise spellings and ranks require archival verification, but their voices remain indispensable. There is an ethical contour to this history that must be maintained. Observing production and receiving kindness did not and should not be read as exculpation for wartime actions. The revelation of concentration camp atrocities posed separate, acute moral questions that industry could not answer. Yet, industry mattered because it produced a social environment in which reconstruction was possible, materially and psychologically. The fact that some former POWs later worked in reconstruction or immigrated to destinations where American techniques proved useful is an empirical note, not a moral ledger. The larger historical consequence is twofold. First, the United States industrial capacity proved decisive in military terms, but equally decisive was how that capacity was perceived by outsiders. For men who had been taught to see America as decadent and disordered, the everyday evidence of coordinated production provided a powerful corrective. Second, the humanitarian frameworks, medical care, the Geneva-compliant camps, educational initiatives created the social conditions for interpersonal exchange and learning that had durable effects on individual lives. As the film of events slows toward its epilogue, imagine again the small sensory moments. The cold bite of canned peaches on a summer afternoon in a cannery. The soft hiss of air conditioners in Pullman cars. The thud of a rivet gun at Willow Run. The quiet of a camp library where a prisoner underlines a sentence in a book about municipal government. Those images accumulate, and their sum mattered. Historians can debate the weight of each factor. Witnesses testify to the felt reality of those accumulations. For some prisoners, a new vocabulary, technical, civic, ethical, entered their minds and would later influence how they rebuilt their towns and lives. The story closes not with a tidy moral, but with a reflective thesis. America's arsenal was not only steel and engines. It was demonstration, the showing in concrete form of what a society could do when organized for production and when, in many instances, organized with a baseline of human dignity. For the German POWs who encountered this world, the experience was a set of ruptures and repairs. Ruptures in previously held certainties and repairs in the social imagination. Some walked away unchanged. Others carried fragments of what they had seen into their post-war lives. The cumulative effect mattered for the history that followed. One final primary source voice, whose name appears in the captivity papers as Unauftitia verer Burkhardt as transcribed, verification needed, offers a closing reflection often quoted in camp correspondence. We were shown a life we had been taught to despise. In that seeing, something in me loosened. Her phrasing, tentative, personal, captures the essential lesson of this narrative. It is a human story, not a triumphalist one. A story of seeing, of shock, of slow reevaluation, and of the modest, often ambiguous transformations that follow when one is forced to confront a reality at odds with ideology. If this account prompts further curiosity, the primary sources, diaries, camp reports, local newspapers, and military archives offer maps for deeper study. For those who wish to explore, the description below the video contains suggested readings, archival collections, and a list of the key camp and factory sites referenced in this film. Names flagged in the narration as transcribed, verification needed, should be cross-checked with original camp rosters and archival documents for precise spelling and rank. This narrative does not seek to flatten complexity into a single moral. Instead, it aims to show how the practical realities of production and the human practices of care can function as a persuasive force. For the German prisoners who first wrote, "The Americans must be lying," on the margins of a diary, the arc of their journey, across oceans, along rail lines, through factories and hospitals, into classrooms, produced a lived argument. Seeing was, in many cases, learning. Abundance was evidence, and human kindness, even within the constraints of captivity, proved to be an unpredictable teacher. If this episode resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone interested in wartime history or the social dimensions of conflict. For more detailed source notes, archival links, and an extended bibliography, check the description and the pinned comment. Subscribe to the channel to follow our further explorations into the human stories behind global events. In the end, the hook returns. That single line, June 4, 1943, "The Americans must be lying," remains both a symptom and a symbol. It shows how an established narrative can confront a disconfirming reality and, in some instances, change. The story of shocked German POWs encountering America's industrial might is not simply a tale of machines. It is a study in how ordinary things, lights, trains, medicines, bread, factories, can compel reconsideration. That reconsideration, in turn, helped shape the post-war world in ways subtle and concrete, practical and emotional, never wholly redeeming, but often profoundly altering. Thank you for watching. If you want to delve deeper, the description below includes links to archives, camp reports, and recommended scholarship. Please like, subscribe, and share this episode to help preserve and scrutinize these complex histories.